So with that, we're ready to move on to our next section of highlighted researchers. I also want to thank just all of you who are tuning in. We've got well over 100 people online. I think it's like 130 right now. It's changing by the moment. But, you know, thanks for taking the time at home and in your places of business to tune in. This is our first time at this, and, you know, we're just really grateful to everybody who's shown an interest in what we're doing. So our next session of research introductions, as I said, highlights projects in the stewarding land and water resources space. We've got 3 exciting projects to highlight. And again, pop those questions into the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of each section. So first up, we have Veronica Justen from UW River Falls. I would like to welcome Veronica.
All right, well, thank you, Maria. I'm so happy to get to talk with our summit attendees about some research that I've been conducting and some future prospects I have for additional research that relates to novel dairy cropping systems. So I am a faculty member at University of Wisconsin River Falls in the crop science program, and primarily teach row crop agronomy classes and do some additional research thinking about how to expand our rotations in row crops. And so was very happy to apply for a fellowship to support some of that research related to both cover cropping and interseeding options, primarily for use in corn silage systems. So I'm going to talk on my 2 slides about 2 basic types of studies that I am conducting. And so one whole group of studies that I'm working on have to deal with trying to think about new options for cover crops. And how I'm addressing that question right now is by looking at trying to expand opportunities for radish cover crops. Farmers who are currently using radish cover crops in the upper Midwest can use a variety of different daikon and oilseed radishes, including the very popular tillage radish and groundhog radish varieties that are used typically at the end of the growing season as a end of season cover crop. And they're primarily finding success with this cover crop to try to take care of some compaction issues that they might be seeing in their fields, as well as to manage some of their nutrient cycling, particularly as it relates to nitrogen cycling. One of the limitations in River Falls and in northern areas of Wisconsin is that the ability for tillage radishes to establish and to provide those compaction relief and nutrient cycling benefits is that we are not able to plant them until later in the growing season, usually after corn silage is removed from a field, so typically middle of September, and this is not typically enough of a growing season for the radishes to properly develop. So what I have been exploring for the past 2 years is trying to evaluate additional types of oilseed and long-rooted radish varieties to see if we might be able to discover a new genetics or a new germplasm of radishes that could be better suited for northern climates. So what I've conducted for the past 2 years is an evaluation trial utilizing germplasm from the United States Department of Agriculture Germplasm Repository. And so myself with several undergraduate research assistants have analyzed 86 different varieties of radish germplasm from the repository, just looking for their characteristics of cold weather growth. And so we've done this in an August and a September planting. An August planting would be representative of what we might expect for a farmer that is following up a small grain, a winter small grain, with the planting of tillage radishes or oilseed radishes, and then a September planting that would be more in line with what we would expect following a corn silage harvest. And so the goal really is to identify those kind of gems in the rough that might perform really well with a late season planting, with a September planting, because that's more likely what we're going to see occurring in a corn silage system. And so on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a data table with several lines that are highlighted. And so we look at several anatomical characteristics of these roots, so diameter and length as a measurement of their growth habit. And as you can see, the highlighted rows indicate varieties, so different genotypes of radishes that perform better than the commercial cultivars. So groundhog and tillage radish have been our commercial cultivars that we've used as kind of checks to see how our kind of experimental varieties might be performing better or worse in some cases than those commercial varieties. So we have looked at this again through an August planting, a September planting, and we have some, indications that there are opportunities to explore new types of genetics for getting better late season growth of these radishes to be incorporated as a cover crop. Along with our root measurements in the field, we also are exploring digital analysis to get a better understanding of the shape of these roots, because we know it's not just the size that matters, but also the root architecture can play a big role in how nutrients are going to be cycled and how water will be cycled through these plants to try to have better positive environmental outcomes. And then ultimately, these varieties that we have been evaluating, we hope that we are going to be able to utilize these in a future plant breeding program. And so on the right-hand side, you can see some scatter plots that indicate that some of the traits that we're looking at have some level of correlation in that when we typically see larger root diameters, especially in the September planting, which is the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, as we see larger root diameters, we typically see longer roots. And so larger diameter and longer roots, again, could have a stronger impact on some of the compaction relieving characteristics of these radishes. So this process, we're just completing our second year of the study with support through the Dairy Innovation Hub, and we are hoping to take kind of our top performers and utilize them in future breeding efforts. So Maria, you can switch to the next slide. Thank you. So then another area that we're exploring for kind of expanding the crop rotations of dairy systems in Wisconsin is looking into interseeding options. So if we think of exploring, ways that we can have cover crops into our rotation, one way is to try to have those cover crops present throughout the whole growing season. And one area that's been being explored as an option for interseeding is changing the row spacing of our corn silage crops and moving from a 30-inch row spacing to a 60-inch row spacing. And so this trial has been, this is in its first year, and because of COVID, our ability to do on-farm research has been impacted. However, we were able to do a small pilot study on-farm in northern Wisconsin with a farmer who has some pair-wide comparisons of 30-inch and 60-inch row corn spread throughout one of his cornfields. And he is growing that corn both for grain as well as for silage. And so what we have been doing in this project is looking a lot at some of the physiological characteristics, so yield components such as ear size, kernel size, the density of the kernels, so the test weight of the kernels, and then overall yield. And so this just represents 1 year of data, but we are, similar to other studies that have been conducted in other parts of Wisconsin and in Iowa, there are obviously some yield differences, especially for grain, where you can see that 30-inch rows do typically give us higher grain yield, but something that we have a lot of promise with is if you look at the forage quality data, that there are some truly significant differences between different row widths and how that impacts some of our feed quality parameters, such as crude protein, dry matter, and lignin production. So what I am personally looking for is I have a strong interest in working on farm with farmer collaborators, and so would be really excited to work with farmers that have an interest, or producers who have an interest in conducting additional 30-inch, 60-inch row side-by-side comparisons to try to look at not only yield and quality differences, but how we can change nutrient cycling and biomass accumulation in between the rows where we are able to interseed cover crops. So it's my pleasure, and I look forward to any questions that we have from the audience. It's my pleasure to introduce Hal Evanson from University of Wisconsin-Platteville.
Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So the project that we're working on is definitely one that's more applied in nature. We have a team, or a group of us from our engineering college here, And so we've got myself from the engineering physics department and my collaborator, Professor Habibi from electrical engineering. And we also have a collaborator from the soil and crop science, Andy Cartmill. And we also have a community partner. We're working with Chris Wilson. You can see in the top right there, that's one of his barns. He runs an organic farm. And he's the one that brought the problem to us, or the challenge that we're working on. And so kind of the problem statement is this. He's got 500 head of cattle that graze on 200 acres. And what he's doing with them is something called rotational grazing, which was new to me, but the illustration in the lower right, the satellite image, kind of helps show it. What he does is he allows the cattle to walk down those purple lanes, and then they go into a different sector every day. And so he's got it fenced off with those orange lines. And the idea is that the cattle will graze in a particular region of the pasture, and then in the spring, he'll move that, so they'll have twice a day sections, and then after that it'll just be one section per day. But the idea here is to prevent overgrazing and to also make sure that they do graze it enough. And there's a benefit, he estimates, of about $100 per head per year, and this is really in feed costs. So reduced feed costs because they're eating out in the pasture instead of in the barn. And it's just better in general for the health of the cattle. And there is, of course, a cost associated with this. And so the cost is about $10 per head per year. Roughly speaking, about a third of that is given over to hardware costs. And so in the central photos here, you can see the system that he's currently using. It's a commercial system. It's based on the electrified line called turbo wire. And kind of the neat idea is in the bottom photo, this spoke. Essentially, it runs a wire through the spoke. It runs across the pasture. And so what he does then is he drags it forward, once or twice a day. And so there's labor involved, and that's the other 2/3 roughly of the estimated cost. And so the question put to us was, is this process something that we can automate? And then if we can automate it, can we also use that as a platform to collect data on the herd, right? Data and information is increasingly becoming a benefit, something that we want to exploit in agriculture. And so if we have some method of doing this, can we get data out? And so there are solutions out there that could address this. They're rather expensive. So current technique includes GPS systems where your cattle are wearing special collars. However, for this application, that really is overkill. We don't really need to track the cattle's position all day long. And really something like this is only cost effective for like giant beef herds out west with really large grazing areas. And so what we're working on here then is more of a local solution, something that would work on a smaller scale and would basically give us what we need and would provide something that we could build upon to get future benefits as well. So if I could go to the next slide, Maria, that'd be great. Thank you. And so what we're pursuing here, because frankly, it's a pretty tight price point. And so it's not inherently obvious to us what the winning solution is going to be. And so we're pursuing a couple of tracks. And so I'm kind of working on the mechanical track, and Dr. Habibi is working on the electrical track. And so we started this work in the summer. And so in the summer, I was working with some students, and we were basically doing preliminary design work. We were wrapping our hands around this problem because this is rather different from other projects we've worked on in the past. And so we kind of defined the problem, which was no small task, and also kind of came up with some alpha level ideas. And so now currently this semester, I'm working with a senior design team from our mechanical engineering program. And so they're building up a prototype. And so that white image in the bottom center is kind of their drawing of what they're working on. And it's an electrified cart, we could call it. And it actually is built on a insight that they had when they realized that, if you look at the satellite photo here in the left, every time the worker goes into the field, they're on their ATV. They're not walking out there. They've got the ATV. And so the student idea was, well, let's leverage this fact that they've got the ATV. And so we can have a trailer. And so the idea then is that we would hook this trailer onto the ATV. They would drive it forward. And if I look at this, under the little roof on the top, we have a winch, a remote-controlled winch. So we would loosen it as we drive forward. That would give us some slack. And then we'd wind it up, and it would advance the fencing. And also, you can see these wires around it. Anytime if you want to keep the cattle away from something, you can't just ask them, you have to force them. And so we're going to be an electrified cart. And then also, right, this now is a platform that can be used for sensors. So if we look again at the satellite image, these little orange openings here, those represent the gates or the openings that the cattle are using to enter the field. And so this cart is going to be located next to the openings. And so one could imagine that the cattle might be wearing some beacon or some kind of special collar, and then our platform would be able to track and see who's coming and going. Because at present, the cattle, right, they open the doors on the barn and the cattle are free to come and go as they please. And so we don't even really know which cattle are spending time in the pasture, much less what they're doing when they get there. Are they eating? Are they just laying down and enjoying the sun? And so this is kind of a step that, this would be a nice platform that we could use to start collecting some of that information. So that's on the mechanical front. So we're building that prototype this semester. Next semester, I'm going to work with a senior design team in engineering physics, and we'll refine this, and we'll also tackle more of the electrical issues. So the sensor platform, I'm expecting we're going to have some electrification issues with the high voltage lines and other things like that. On the electrical side, Dr. Habibi has been working with his students on this idea of small virtual fencing, which has a really big upside, but it's a much bigger challenge as well. And what he is using is this white image at the bottom right is a positional GPS. And so that one is similar to what we have in our phones, where it tells us where we are without needing to send data up into a satellite network. And then And so that would be part of something that would go into, say, a cow collar. So I just have representative images in the bottom right. Those are certainly not ours. And then you would have posts that the worker puts out, and these posts would have beacons or something that is being used to demarcate the paddock that we want to keep the cattle in. And so the idea is that the cattle get too close to the posts, they'll be dissuaded. And how that would be done is kind of open. We're looking at electrical and as well as audio cues. I mean, we're not keeping them from a highway, and so it's not absolutely critical, that we keep them in. And so we've got a little bbit more design leeway there. And so at any rate, that's what he's working on. They're building up a prototype. And I just do like to point out with projects like this, right, the bulk of the work is done with students, so it's a great opportunity for engineering students to get involved in these agricultural type of products. And so we're at the point where we're building up prototypes and hopefully we'll be able to try things out in the spring. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions. At this point, I'd like to hand it off to Professor Jill Coleman. She's with the Department of Plant and Earth Science at UW River Falls.
Thank you, Hal. I am happy to be here today, so thank you for the invitation to participate in this opportunity to share my plans for this research fellowship. I do teach at UW River Falls. I am an associate professor of environmental science in our plant and earth science department, so most of my teaching centers around natural systems, and I have a specific research interest and focus on how elements and contaminants move through natural and less natural systems. And so my project is looking at how do we address groundwater contamination in our agricultural communities. A few years ago, I was approached by the Western Wisconsin Conservation Council, which is a relatively new farmer-led watershed council in our region of Western Wisconsin. And they were interested in not just looking at surface issues, surface water issues in the region, but they were really thinking about groundwater. And so they actually sought our institution out and were looking for someone to help them investigate nitrate concentrations in the well water of the membership of the new council. And so this partnership developed before the Dairy Innovation Hub became available, but the Dairy Innovation Hub has been a really amazing opportunity to expand the work that we're already doing with local farmers in our region. So I I think, let's see, we can move on to the next slide, please, Maria. So if we look across the state of Wisconsin, nitrate is elevated in groundwater across the state. The map on the upper left-hand corner of this slide is showing you average nitrate concentrations that have been found in well water across different portions or across the counties of Wisconsin. And you can see that you know, the brighter colors, the warmer colors show up indicating higher levels of nitrate, especially in agricultural regions. And then there are some differences that are associated with things like soils and bedrock and you know, the aquifers that people are drawing their well water from. And this is an amazing data set that's been collected and compiled by UW-Stevens Point, and it's available online, and if anybody is interested in investigating this further, that with their well water quality viewer. So that's where the data here are coming from. Circled on the map, you can see the region that UW River Falls is located, and the area where the farmer-led watershed council, the Western Wisconsin Conservation Council, is kind of up and operating. And so that's where I'm working with local farmers. If you look at the figure below that, it's that data set is just showing it's showing average nitrate concentrations in the wells that we sample for the farmers. And so we might sample 4 wells on any given farmer's property, you know, irrigation wells, wells that are being used to provide water for livestock, as well as wells that are providing water for homes. And I have the data organized just from lowest to highest. And so you can see that a lot of wells are fall below the 10 milligrams per liter level there, and that's the health standard. So once we start to get above 10 parts per million, then we are concerned about human health, and there are some particularly concerning health effects once we get above 10 parts per million, especially for those who are most vulnerable in our population, like infants and developing fetuses. So elevated nitrate levels in water can lead to what's termed blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia, where the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood doesn't function as well because it's essentially being occupied by nitrate or nitrite really, but anyway. So you can see from the data, you know, we have some wells that are falling well below that health standard. About 20 of those wells are falling below the health standard, but you can also see that we have a good number of wells that are approaching that health standard, that are kind of sitting there around 10 parts per million. And then concerning to the membership of our the Farmer-Led Watershed Council, you know, 35 wells in our data set have average nitrate concentrations above that health standard. Now that's protective of the most vulnerable, you know, the acute effects of nitrate concentrations in water for the most vulnerable in our population. We're also seeing some studies come out looking at the chronic effects of nitrate, you know, consuming a lot of nitrate for adults and others in our population. And those studies are actually finding chronic effects at lower concentrations of nitrate, even as low as about 3 parts per million. We're seeing increased incidences of things like colorectal cancers. Now, the research is still, you know, in development, and the studies are still being conducted, but some I think concerning early findings from some of the research. So this is a really important problem in our region in western Wisconsin as well as across the whole state. And this doesn't even touch on what the effects might be for livestock, right? Because livestock are also consuming this elevated nitrate water that we're pulling out of wells. So my research questions are really looking at how do, you know, how can the farmers in the Watershed Council change their activities, modify their activities in order to, you know, reduce nitrate that's maybe moving from landscape surface into the subsurface. That's primarily been found to be the main reason behind elevated nitrate in groundwater. Certainly soils and other natural factors play a role in how easily that nitrate gets down there, but if we're putting nitrate on the landscape surface, there are ways for that nitrate to get down into the groundwater. So I'm hoping to look at what practices the farmers are doing are most effective at reducing nitrate and nutrient leaching in a particular area, because we know the world is it's variable, right? It has, there's so much heterogeneity across landscapes. What might work for one area may not exactly work for another area. In the upper right-hand corner of this slide, you can see some preliminary data that we collected in a small pilot study looking at nitrate as it made its way through the soil profile under different land use practices. So my research project is hoping to expand that preliminary work that we did 2 summers ago. I'm also interested in looking at, especially those wells that have very high nitrate concentrations. Why are those wells showing those high nitrate concentrations, and can we determine the source of nitrate that's getting to those wells so that we can better protect those folks that are relying on those wells for their drinking water and for their livestock needs. So that's kind of the summary of my research in a nutshell, and with that I'm going to turn it back to Maria for our Q&A session.
Great, thanks so much. I want to reiterate to folks, if you have questions, pop them into the chat box from your media player. And then also, I want to let you know again that the contact information for all of our speakers is located on our website on the abstract tab. So if you want to contact some of these folks after the event, feel free to go ahead and do that. So we've got a couple of questions. We'll start with, this one's for Hal. Do you think virtual fencing will lower the barriers for farmers who don't have grazing infrastructure to take advantage of partial or seasonal grazing?
Oh. Well, given my limited background in this area, that had not occurred to me, but I could certainly see that being the case. Yeah, definitely. Much, my analogy would be, right, cell phone towers kind of greatly increase the reach of cell phones. This would be similar, right? If you've got a package that you can kind of carry out and install as needed, yes, that would definitely do that. And beyond that, the reason I say that the virtual one has a really big upside, it's that ours is kind of limited to the terrain, right? The mechanical version, you still want to have a wide open terrain, but a lot of times what you want to do is have the cattle grazing in terrain where it's really not good to put crops. And so if you can have them grazing in gullies, near streams, things like that. And so the virtual fencing would really open up the possibilities as to where you could allow the cattle to graze. So.
Thanks. And next question is for Veronica. Seems like radishes have potential for interseeding. Is there added value in diversifying the species that are interseeded or used as cover crops, or is just having a cover crop sufficient to achieve the benefit?
That's a great question, Maria. And I certainly don't know all the answers, but our best understanding with the evidence is that having any sort of living root, as long as you can in the growing season beyond, so winter covers, having a living root as long as possible is where we find the greatest benefit in terms of having cover crops. And that one of the benefits of all brassica species is that they metabolize nitrogen pretty quickly. And so that's what makes them really great in a rotation for nitrogen cycling. And I'm in strong favor of expanding any sort of cover crop opportunities, because whenever we expand any part of our rotation, we hopefully are diversifying ourselves and minimizing risk. That's one of the big risks we have, is that we have a very narrow kind of crop rotation on most of our land. However, there's a risk in trying something new. And that's why I think we see so much use of cereal rye, annual ryegrasses. And then of course, there's been a big surge in the use of brassicas, so radishes, turnips, and rapeseed for cover crops. And I don't know if we will see increases in, going beyond those kind of groups of grasses and brassicas and some legumes. But I think there's definitely opportunities for expanding the types of brassicas we use. I hope that answered the question they were asking.
Thanks. The last question is for Jill. Community water testing is a great way to better understand the state of your well, but it seems that there is still a lot of confusion across stakeholders and consumers regarding what those results mean or don't mean. How do we better educate and communicate this important information?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think so. My work with the Western Wisconsin Conservation Council grows out, I think, of maybe some of concern about how results are used, how those community testing results are used. I think sometimes folks are a little reticent to participate in community well testing programs because there's a perception that those results might be used to point fingers at people who are maybe causing as the source of problems. I don't know of examples where that's true, but I don't know of all examples of everything. So I'm not going to say that I could guarantee that those results wouldn't be used. But I think that the reason for most community well testing is because we want to get a handle on the scope and scale of the problem. There's no way that we can start to address these problems if we don't first understand where we're at. So I think that's one important thing to communicate. I also think it's very important to communicate how results are being used and what their purpose is. My work with Western Wisconsin Conservation Council, we have very high standards for protecting the identity of the members, and so any results that we report, we report directly to the members, and then the board does not get any of that identifying information, just summary information. And I think that that might be a way to kind of break down some of these barriers or tensions that we might see when it comes to people being reticent to participating in community well testing programs, that no, this isn't going to come back and impact you negatively. And I think that's really true for groundwater. There may be specific instances where maybe there is one system or septic or something like that could be contributing to the issue, but really most groundwater systems are kind of large integrators of everything that's kind of happening in a landscape. So I think it's, we want to be really careful about saying that one person's well results represent what they are doing in the landscape, because that is, I think I can safely say by and large that's absolutely not true. So I think in terms of these testing programs and getting buy-in, it's really important to make it clear what those results are being used for and how they help our communities be more resilient and help protect the health of our communities, as well as improve quality of life for the participants. So.
Great, thank you very much.